Let's try that. Say words.
Words.
Words with friends.
Words with friends.
Words with enemies.
Words with enemies.
Welcome to VCR, a vintage cinema rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And I'm Michael.
And today, we're doing one of my favorite movies of all time. I'm really excited.
I can tell.
Trainspotting, 1996.
Yeah. You don't even need that Monster Energy drink to get jazzed up.
No, I don't. This movie is honestly, like I said, one of my all-time favorites. It's a classic from the 90s. It's one of the greatest Scottish movies ever made. You don't need to wait for my review in the second part of our episode to hear my thoughts. I love this movie.
I watched it for the first time last night, and it's very 90s.
Yeah.
Like, it really captures the aesthetic and the attitude of the 90s.
Yeah.
Almost like Fight Club.
Yes,
This
that
is
is going to be a movie that we come back to for sure. During this podcast.
Like a lot of Mark Renton's dialogue I could picture Edward Norton in Fight Club saying the exact same thing, just presumably with less heroin.
Yeah, honestly, that's a great comparison. Like I said, we'll be talking about that again. Before we get into the episode, though, again, we are trying out a new structure. So we're doing our primer episode here, where we don't really talk too many spoilers. We kind of just lay out what this movie is, who it's for, and when you should check it out, and where you should check it out. And then the second part that comes out about a week after is where we get into all our spoiler discussion, our personal reviews of the movie, and just diving into all the behind-the-scenes fun.
Yeah, that's right. So that if you like what you hear, that gives you a chance to check it out for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And I hope you check this one out.
Definitely.
Because spoilers, it's awesome. Mike, do you want to give us a quick plot summary?
All right. So Trainspotting follows our good friend Ewan McGregor as Mark Rentboy Renton, a unemployed 26-year-old heroin addict. And he has three close friends, Daniel Spud Murphy, played by Ewan Bremer, Simon Sickboy Williamson as Johnny Lee Miller, and the always fantastic Robert Carlyle as Francis Franco Bigby. The whole movie is essentially just these four friends.
And Tommy. Don't forget Tommy.
And Tommy. Can't forget Tommy. The movie follows these four friends and Tommy as they struggle to get clean, then start using again, then get clean again, then start using again. And yeah, this movie really captures what it feels like to be an addict.
Yeah, there's kind of two parts to it, I think. There's the addiction part, which is the biggest part, and what drug use and abuse does to people. As a smaller piece to this, it's also kind of getting older and having these friends that you've been friends with your whole life, these niche group of guys that you grew up with, and how kind of everybody's starting to grow apart, maybe grow a little bit different. Some people who were maybe assholes as kids grow up to be assholes as adults, and it just exacerbates the problem when you mix drugs and alcohol into it.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of an aspect to this movie that I also want to talk about a little bit more when we get into the spoiler section.
Yeah, too. Like not to jump the gun or anything, but like this movie really captures the dark side of friendship.
Yeah, like it really does.
Almost the word toxic gets bandied about a little too much, but like these 4, 5, 6 friends and how bad they are for each other.
Yeah.
What little affection they have for each other and how they constantly seem to just bring each other down, drag each other back down into the muck.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
the toilet in this case.
And so, you and I have been talking about this as kind of a dark movie. Like, if you know nothing going in, it sounds like this is a movie that's very dark. But
yes.
That's where you might be wrong. This is maybe one of the top 10 most stylish movies of all time.
This movie has a lot of energy to it.
Yes.
Which is ironic considering it's about heroin.
Yeah. It's when it comes down to it, whether it's the score or just how fast scenes play out, what's happening between scenes, seeing multiple different stories play out all at the same time, it's really a breakneck pace movie. There's no slow moments to this movie ever.
The opening scene of the movie is Mark being chased by the authorities.
Yeah.
So this movie starts in a dead sprint.
Yes.
And then you get his voiceover as he's running, getting hit by cars, all that fun stuff. Yeah, this movie does not stop. There were parts later on that I thought maybe could have used a little more elaboration, but I think it really, again, it gets to the heart of what it's like to be an addict.
Right.
Just constantly jonesing for your next fix, willing to do anything to do it. Like, it's, yeah. This movie almost made me nauseous at different parts.
I believe it made Jess nauseous at parts, which we'll talk about later. It's one of the most disturbing yet stylish movies ever made, for sure.
Yeah.
So let's talk characters and people you may know. So you've already mentioned a lot of the main characters. So we'll start with Mark Rentboy Renton, played by Ewan McGregor. This is my favorite of his roles. You might also know Ewan McGregor. He's still a pretty prominent actor. He's been playing Obi-Wan for the last 20 years.
By the way, I want to add, if you suffered through the Disney Plus Obi-Wan series and you want to remind yourself that Ewan McGregor can still act, go back and watch this movie.
Yeah. He's in season 3 of Fargo, which is probably my least favorite of the first 3 seasons, but he's still great in it. Big Fish is a movie from the early 2000s that is very, very good. Stars him. He's in Doctor Sleep, the new Doctor Sleep.
That's right. I didn't like that movie, but he was pretty good in it.
I really enjoyed that movie.
He also was in Ghostwriter by Roman Polanski, which is a pretty good thriller.
Cool. The most relevant other thing that he's been in, like most recently, he was in Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio.
He was?
Yeah, he was Jiminy Cricket.
Oh, I have not had the pleasure.
I have not watched it either. But yeah, so Ewan McGregor, pretty prominent actor. This is kind of the movie that put him on the map as well. So it's important, if you're a fan of his, to maybe check this one out. Mark Renton, we haven't really talked as much about him. He's, like you said, he's Mark our Renton? Main... What?
Oh, sorry, I cut you off. I thought you were talking about somebody else, and you said Mark Renton by mistake. Oh, no. This is awkward. Okay. Sorry, proceed.
Mark is like our main character. He's also our narrator throughout the film, and he's pretty prominent narrator. Again, think Fight Club. He's a kind of a morally ambiguous character to be following because he's not the best character. He's not the best person.
I don't know if this is jumping ahead to the next part, but you kind of can't help but feel for Mark and kind of like Mark.
Yeah.
But he's constantly making the lives of the people around him worse.
Yeah.
Like, he's constantly screwing over his friends.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, maybe, like, you kind of attach yourself to him because he's the viewpoint character, but there's multiple moments you're like, oh, like, you're not a good person.
Yeah.
You're
exactly
pretty amoral.
Yeah. Our next character that I want to talk about is Sick Boy, who is, again, probably the second main character. It's probably Mark's best friend of the group. They spend a lot of time together anyway, and also probably his most prominent drug-doing friend.
Drug-using friend?
Drug-using friend, yeah. He's a very interesting character because he seems almost somewhat intelligent, but at the same time struggles with the same problems that Mark does. Like, he's a big fan of James Bond, and he's probably got the most he's got the best vocabulary of everybody. Like, he's intelligent with what he's talking about.
There's a couple different moments where he's like wasted or high, and he's going off on this rant or something, and he's a gifted speaker. Although Mark does point out that he's probably never sat through a James Bond movie sober. So
true.
Maybe take everything he's saying with a grain of salt.
And so he's played by Johnny Lee Miller, who his most relevant performance of recent is Sherlock in the show Elementary. It's the longest, it's the longest portrayal of Sherlock Holmes in TV and movie ever. It was like 180 episodes or 160 episodes, something like that.
Wow. Yeah. That's with Lucy Liu as...
Yeah, it is Lucy Liu.
Joan Watson, not John Watson. Wow. Good for him.
Yeah.
I hope someone actually watched it. But
I have to imagine they did, seeing it's the longest running Sherlock performance ever.
It's funny. There's all these network TV shows that, like, you kind of just... You see them in your periphery, and then you look away, and then you look back 10 years later, and you're like, wait, it's still going?
Yeah.
Wait, it has how many episodes? Like,
Our next character I want to talk about is Spud, who's kind of probably the least intelligent of the group. He just always seems to be the one to run into trouble. And nothing ever goes right.
There's
for him.
also kind of, like, I feel like of the 5 or 6 main characters, he might be the most ethically clean.
Yes.
Which maybe that's going a little too easy on him, but like there's like a weird bewildered innocence about him.
Yes, that's a great way to describe it.
Yeah, and I feel like we've all had a friend like Spud, right? Who like he doesn't really get what's going on, and like maybe he doesn't really grasp social cues, but like he's pure of heart, but nothing ever goes right for him. I distinctly had a friend like that in high school.
Yeah.
I've probably been that friend.
I guarantee you've been that friend for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he's played by Ewan Bremner, who is a really great actor in this movie. Like, he really sells the character. And funny enough, he actually played Mark in the play theater adaptation of this, which was the first version of this.
Interesting.
And then pivoted into the role of Spud as well. Where you most likely know him from is in the 2013 movie Snowpiercer. He plays Andrew, the father. That's one of my favorite apocalypse movies of all time.
That's the one with the train, right?
Yeah.
Haven't
It's
seen it.
Chris Evans. Oh, it's so good. So good. And then he's also in the newest Wonder Woman, or not the newest, but like, the newest iteration.
The
He's
2017
in the first
one?
Yeah, he's in that.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He plays a World War I soldier with PTSD.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was good in that too. That wasn't a bad movie.
Yeah, I've heard that, and I haven't seen that one. So our next character, and we're almost rounding out the main group of friends here, is Begbie, who you already mentioned, Robert Carlyle. He's a bit of an alcoholic, and like Mark says near the beginning of the movie, he doesn't do drugs, he does people. And that's a great way to describe it, is he is such an asshole, and like he's such an angry little man. And basically he is the guy who, and you probably know a friend like this, who goes to the bar looking to pick a fight. And it's never him who caused it.
Right. Like there's a great scene really early in the movie when he's spouting some nonsense about a fight he got into. We find out what actually happened from Tommy later. And then they're sitting on like the second floor of this bar, and he just casually tosses his drink over his shoulder, lands on some woman's head. She's all bloody. He comes downstairs, whips out his knife. He's like, no one's leaving till we find out who glassed that poor lady. Like, he's easily the worst human being in this movie.
Oh yeah, and I will say that is part of, in the spoiler, I want to have the debate over whether or not he is the worst in this movie.
Okay,
but he is definitely the guy that's the least likable in the group from like the moment this movie starts, basically.
Yeah.
And I want to say, I really love Robert Carlyle. He's not been in like a ton of mainstream massive movies, but I've got a couple references for you of recent. The World Is Not Enough, the James Bond movies. He was the bad guy in that one.
Oh, good for him.
He was in Once Upon a Time as Rumpelstiltskin. Recently, he was in Yesterday, which is another movie of the director of this movie, and he plays John Lennon in that one.
Oh, really?
And they kind of like, they make him look pretty similar to what John Lennon would look like at around this time in his life.
Yeah, I could see it. He's very,
And then our last one that I want to point out is he plays Durza in Aragon.
No way.
The worst adaptation ever.
We were just talking about that recently, and I specifically said to you, the guy who played Durza wasn't bad.
Yeah.
I was like, that wasn't bad casting, so... Wow.
It's a great performance in an otherwise god-awful movie.
I can see it now. Like, I can see it with, like, the makeup and, like, the terrible red wig.
Yeah.
I was like, all right, yeah, he's...
It's such a funny reference because for millennials like us, like, you're going to remember Aragon and how bad it is, and you might honestly remember his performance from it. And it's such a funny movie because you could bring it up and everybody's going to talk about how awful it was.
You want to hear something funny about Aragon?
What?
When it came out, I wanted to go see it, so I showed my dad the trailer, and my dad looked me in the eyes and said, "That looks terrible." But I was so hurt that my dad didn't want to see Aragon with me that he took me to see it out of pity, and we both sat there in the theater staring up at the screen like, ooh, Dad was right.
Yeah, my friends and I went and saw it together. My friend, shout out to Tyler.
I remember that.
And I remember him and I looking at each other distinctly when Avril Lavigne started playing at the end, and I was like,
yeah, I forgot about that.
And I was like, this is really the cherry on top.
Yeah,
this is really it.
Yeah. You know what? Tangent here. There's something, because like I feel like when you're a kid or when you're in like your early teen years, you're pretty easy to impress.
Yeah.
Like you pretty much. I mean, I guarantee that the movies you loved as a kid, a lot of them were terrible. You were just too young to know.
Yeah.
But it's funny when you're that age and you see something so bad that even your underdeveloped prepubescent brain is like, wow, that was terrible.
Yeah,
like,
everybody remembers their first, and for a lot of us, it was Aragon.
I remember you and me went and saw Epic Movie together in theaters.
I have blocked that out of my memory,
apparently. And I remember my mom driving us home, and I feel like, you know, I looked out the left window, you looked out the right window, and that was it. We couldn't even look at each other.
All right, well, let's move back into our discussion of Trainspotting. Our last kind of main group of guys, one of the friends, Tommy, he's probably the straightest one out of all of them. Like, doesn't do drugs at the beginning. He doesn't do hard drugs at the beginning anyway. He's got a girlfriend. He's kind of got his life more or less put together.
He benches.
Yeah, he's more than the rest of the guys. He has his life put together.
Mm-hmm.
And he's maybe the character that in the beginning that you can almost maybe relate to the most.
He's almost like again, keeping this metaphor going, we all have that friend who has their, for lack of a better word, shit together.
Yeah.
You know, they're in shape. They know what they're doing. They're doing fine. They bench press in their living room, you know. It's like the older it's like every friend group has the older brother, right? Yeah.
And so that's him. And he's played by Kevin McKidd, which is a name that there's going to be a very specific audience, and I don't know if it's our audience that's going to know that name, because he plays Owen Hunt in Grey's Anatomy, which is a very massive role, and he's a very important star of that show. Funny enough. So this is, again, one of his first movies, and it's a pretty good performance of his, even though he's not necessarily the main person of the
He's
group.
Like the Butters of the movie. Like, not part of the main four, but he's like the honorary fifth Beatle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's just partially because of, like, his interests don't align with the rest of the guys anymore.
That said, his story does come to quite the conclusion.
Yeah. One of the darker endings to the movie.
Yeah.
The last main character that I want to talk about is Diane. She's the somewhat love interest of Mark.
Yeah, more on that later.
Yeah, we won't talk about that too much because I don't want to get into spoiler territory with it.
Yeah.
She's played by Kelly MacDonald in her first role, and it's a pretty good performance by her as well. And for a first role, like, I really enjoy her character and her portrayal. She's pretty relevant actor as well. Like, now she was borderline child actor at this point, being one of the younger cast members in the film, and she voices Prince Meridia in Brave, the Disney movie.
Yeah. Interesting.
She's in No Country for Old Men. She plays Josh Brolin's wife. Pretty memorable character in that movie as well.
Oh, yeah.
She's in Boardwalk Empire as Margaret Thompson, one of the main casts of that show. And the last connection here, and this is not going to be the first time I bring up Harry Potter, but she plays Helena Ravenclaw, the ghost in the Harry Potter series.
Oh, man. I remember that.
Yeah.
I've barely seen any of the Harry Potter movies, but I like Chamber of Secrets, right? She's in the toilet.
I can't remember. No, you're thinking Moaning Myrtle.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which connection to this movie. So we'll get to that.
Okay.
Momentarily. But talking about the cast here. So almost every one of those cast members is actually Scottish. I gotta say that this is probably the greatest ensemble of Scottish actors ever in a movie. Period,
Scots.
bar none.
Yeah, this is a very Scottish movie. Yeah. Let's put it that way.
So there's a few other people that I want to mention. Connections, people you might be interested in watching. Peter Mullen, Mother Superior, the first drug dealer we meet. Really, really great character. He's maybe one of the greatest Scottish bad guys ever. And here's my argument for that. He plays James Delos. He's in season 2 of Westworld, the CEO of Westworld.
Oh, really?
He plays Jacob Snell in Ozark, the main bad guy of season 1 of Ozark, and later seasons, I think. I haven't seen all the seasons of that yet. And he plays King Durin in The Rings of Power, the new Lord of the Rings show.
So he's He's a bad guy.
He's a bad guy.
He was born to play a bad guy.
Oh, and he does it so well, too.
Yeah, which is interesting because he doesn't look outwardly sinister.
Yeah.
He's actually weirdly likable in this movie, which actually, owing to the subject matter, that almost makes him even worse. Because there's one scene in particular towards the end where, like, him and Rent Boy kind of do this little thing where he's like, "Oh, how will you be joining us tonight, sir?"
Yeah.
And he's like, "I'm afraid your credit has been overextended." He's like, "Hard cash will be fine, sir.
Yeah.
Would you like some garlic bread to start?"
Yeah, he's a very charismatic actor, and that's what makes him such a great bad guy.
Yeah.
It's really hard not to like him.
Yeah.
The other characters, so quickly going to run through it. James Cosmo, Mark's dad. You've probably seen in Game of Thrones. He was Jorah Mormont.
Oh my God,
Yeah.
you're right. The
Yep.
Lord Commander of the Night's Watch.
Yep. Shirley Henderson plays Gail, who is Moaning Myrtle in Harry Potter.
Who was she in the movie?
She's Gail. She's...
Oh, the sick boy's girlfriend?
No, she's one of the other guy's girlfriends.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah, I think I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. Irvine Welsh plays Mark Forrester, one of the other drug dealers, the less prominent kind of like hopeless drug dealer. Irvine Welsh, kind of relevant to Trainspotting because he just happens to be the author of the original book.
Yeah.
Which we are definitely going to talk about when we get to the spoiler section. And I have one other actor I'm going to mention. Keith Allen is Welsh, one of the few cast members who is not actually Scottish, but he just so happens to be Lillian Alfie Allen's dad. Two very prominent actors in our day and age.
Who did they play in the movie?
Keith Allen, not Lillian Alfie. Lillian Alfie Allen are actual people. Keith Allen plays the final drug dealer at the end of the movie, who they do a drug deal with.
Oh, that guy. Yeah.
So, funny enough, there's a connection to a earlier movie that is also connected to this movie, and he is important to that. We're going to talk about that in spoilers, though, I think.
Okay.
So our director, to round things off, Danny Boyle, one of my favorite directors. He's done a number of movies that I all really enjoy, and one movie that we've talked about already on this podcast. So he did the Trainspotting sequel, which we're going to talk about later. Yeah. He did 28 Days Later, which you brought up in the draft video.
No shit.
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. He's also the director of Slumdog Millionaire, one of the biggest movies of the year that came out in the mid-2010s.
I think that was like 2008.
Oh, okay.
That was a good movie, though.
Yeah. Very important movie. He did 127 Hours, which was a good movie.
Oh, yeah. With, what's his name? James Franco.
Yeah, James Franco.
James Franco.
Yesterday, which is a really enjoyable movie that Jess and I had a lot of fun with, about a guy who wakes up and realizes that he's the only one who remembers the Beatles.
That's right. That just came out recently, too.
Yeah, last 5-6 years. COVID time, right?
COVID time, right. Yeah. You mean 10 years ago.
So let's dive into who this movie is for, and also a little bit, does this movie hold up in a modern watch? I'm going to start that with my first question. Does this movie hold up to a modern watch? Because this is your first time watching it.
I'm kind of going to repeat some of what I said for Die Hard, in the sense that, like, this is a very enjoyable movie. Well, let me walk it back. This is a very good, well-made movie.
Yep.
And I think it does generally hold up to a modern watch, but there is one specific uncomfortable plot point that certainly does not hold up.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough.
Maybe we can talk about that a little more in spoilers.
Yeah.
But all in all, is it too soon for me to jump into a personal review?
Yes. I want you to save that.
All right. Well, boy, do I have opinions.
Okay.
So,
well, I'm glad that you think it holds up. I think it holds up as well. You could maybe make an argument that, is this the most beautiful film? Like, is it shot on the highest quality camera? No. It's basically an indie movie almost. Like, it was very, very low budget. But with what they did with the film, just the dialogue, the pacing, the music, everything about that aspect of this film makes it such a good watch that you're not like going to forget about maybe the lower quality footage, but you're just going to be so engrossed in everything going on.
I think the lower quality footage almost kind of works to its own advantage.
Yeah.
Because it really highlights kind of the grunginess and the squalor of what these people's lives are really like.
Yeah, I very much agree. And that might be missed on some people, though.
Sure.
It is
well,
what I
screw
would say.
those people.
Yeah.
Turn off the podcast.
So who's this movie for? It's kind of a black dramedy. Like it's really funny, but it's also a drama.
It's pitch black.
Yeah, and this movie does a really, really good job of changing its tone throughout the movie.
There's one particular thing that happens maybe just over a third of the way in that when it happened, I was like, oh, like this isn't funny.
Yeah.
Like I'm not laughing right now.
The first 30 minutes of this movie are hilarious. Like you really laugh like quite a bit, and like you said, there's a turning point in the movie where it's like, oh no, this is actually serious. Like
the opening in particular, like the first 5 minutes are completely intoxicating. Like we open with Renton being chased, he has his big dramatic voiceover, and then we cut to like a disgusting apartment. There's a little baby crawling around. They're all doing heroin. Sick Boy is ranting about James Bond factoids, and like it gets you right away. It's so like it hooks you right away.
Yeah, it's really effective at that, and it's really effective at introducing the characters. It kind of does like a video game reference here, but it's almost like a Borderlands type of like introduction to all of the characters, because it's like this flashy like this is the character and this is like who they're about. Like it does a really good job in like less than a minute of basically like describing each character to you with very, very little. Like you know who Bagby is after like a minute of seeing him on screen.
Yeah, the way they introduce Renton too, like we open with him running, he has his little voiceover. He kind of gets hit by a car. We see him through the windshield as though we're the driver.
Right.
He looks directly into the camera and he flashes this like grotesque smile.
Yeah.
And then his name shows up in text on screen. You're just like, all right, I'm paying attention.
Yeah.
Like,
oh yeah. So it's really effective at drawing you in. I want to describe this movie with 3 movies combined.
Okay.
And that is, so describing this movie with 3 movies is Snatch, Fight Club, and Pulp Fiction on heroin.
yes.
If you had...
The heroin is the most important ingredient.
yeah. If you made a movie that combined those 3 movies and added heroin, it would be Trainspotting.
I agree.
I think...
Actually, I'm not familiar with Snatch.
Oh, we're watching Snatch at some point. It's one of my
Okay.
favorites of all time. That's, oh no, who's the director of Snatch? Guy Ritchie.
Okay.
And so... It's this movie has like almost like a Guy Ritchie.
I was about to say
style to it, but
if
not
you told
quite.
me Guy Ritchie directed this movie, I wouldn't even blink.
Yeah, it's very much along those lines. So modern TV that's kind of related to this film is Always Sunny in Philadelphia, because it feels like some of the characters of that show are kind of inspired by this movie, as well as some of the antics of the show also feel to be in line with this movie, with less maybe consequences or less darkness to the consequences of the show.
It's interesting. I was kind of getting It's Always Sunny vibes, especially in the scenes where they're at those gritty dive bars. Yeah.
So I think people at this point, if you're interested in any of those, I think you're going to like this one a lot. Now, on that note, I got to say that, like you said, there's a lot of disturbing content in this movie. Like there's a very distinct point about 30 minutes in where you're like, oh no, this is a serious movie. There are consequences to what they're doing. And so you're going to see like there's stuff like drug overdose, drug use, there's death, there's alcoholism.
Boy, is there death.
There's angry people doing really angry, stupid things. Like if any of those things are something that maybe triggers you, this isn't going to be a movie for you.
Yeah, you know, I'm just going to say, like, I'm pretty stone cold when it comes to the content I consume. Like, it takes a lot to rattle me. This movie made me genuinely squeamish and nauseous at points.
Yeah.
Like, this is a spoiler for my personal review, but, like, I liked this movie, but I also couldn't wait for it to be over.
That's fair.
Yeah.
That is very fair.
Yeah.
The obvious comparison to kind of wrap this up in my point of view is Requiem for a Dream.
That's right.
I think that this movie's more effective than Requiem for a Dream because I think Requiem for a Dream is a lot more ham-fisted. It's less rewatchable than this film.
You don't think this movie's a little ham-fisted?
No, I think that this film is more effective at what it's trying to sell people on, and that drugs are bad, basically.
Okay.
I think I don't know. That's my opinion. If you had to pick one or the other, for me, it's always going to be Trainspotting, just because there's fun aspects. That the style is more my kind of vibe. Like the 3 movies that I listed off are all 3 like all-time favorite movies. So that's kind of where my taste in films
This is very much a Blake movie.
This is such a Blake movie. This is why I picked this one. And
when Danny Boyle was making this movie, he was thinking to himself, like, I wonder what Blake would think of this scene.
I wonder what 3-year-old Blake is going to think about this one.
I need to convince 3-year-old Blake not to do
heroin.
Yeah,
about 30 years in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, do you have any other, like, who this movie is for? Any other thoughts on who you'd recommend this to?
That's a good question. I'm going to use my canned answer, which is if you're interested in cinema and the history of cinema, you'd probably really appreciate this movie. And especially, I think it's important for guys like us, because you and I are both 30. Mm-hmm. We were little kids in the 90s. And like I said, I think before we started recording, like, this movie really does just bleed 90s energy.
Yeah.
Like that kind of gritty punk sensibility, that kind of like anti-authoritarian, anti-consumerist edge.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
well, and this movie came out in 1996, which is about midway through the 90s, right? And it's kind of a chicken and egg situation here, because this movie also kind of maybe influenced the culture of that era as well, in that grungy area. Like, there were other aspects already going on, obviously, but you can't undersell the importance of this movie in the 90s culture.
Yeah, you can definitely, if you cut this movie down the middle like it's a tree, you can see all the different you can count all the different 90s rings in there. That metaphor makes no sense, but I'm sticking by it.
That was an interesting one, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's segue into when to watch. This is a blockbuster movie. Like, this movie has just the style of it. It's a movie that you're going to be drawn into. It's a movie that you're going to want to pay attention to. I would just put it on, like, Saturday night, big movie to watch. That's where I feel it fits best. It's also, you have to be someone emotionally ready for everything that's about to happen too.
Yeah, oh boy. I watched it last night in my apartment, Saturday night, and yeah, it's a movie you really need to. You know, it's funny. I didn't watch it. I watched it at like 6 p.m., so it was over at like 7:30, and then I had to just sit there for like 4 hours before I went to bed, just processing it.
Yeah.
So maybe I don't know. Watch it a little later than I did.
Yeah, that's fair. Do you think this is the greatest anti-drug movie ever made?
Well, no, because I want to try heroin now.
You might be the only one after seeing this movie.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I don't want to get too oversharey, but I have a very close friend who has struggled with hard drug use, and watching this movie just broke my fucking heart.
Yep.
Like, just, I felt so much for that friend. Like, just how,
and that's maybe part of the selling point of this movie as well, is not only is it a great movie of like, drugs are bad, kids, don't do drugs, but it's also like a good movie to learn how to empathize with people who are struggling with these kind of situations, right?
I think as a culture, we're kind of coming around, and we're not like demonizing addicts anymore. Like, we're recognizing that there's other factors going on. And to this movie's credit, like, it does show a little bit of the complexity behind addiction. Like, Mark Renton is clearly struggling. He lives in Edinburgh, which is like an economically depressed area, and like he's also struggling with clearly psychological depression.
Right.
Like, there are moments when he gets sober and he's just struggling with what to do.
Yeah.
Like, having no chemical buffer between himself and his depression. And
right.
that often leads to him using again.
Yep.
And I mean, if you grow up in such a shitty, economically depressed area and all your friends are addicts and like you have no skills or prospects of the future. Also, like, I feel like when you're in your early to mid 20s, you're kind of just suffering. You know, it's like
it's a struggle because you're suddenly an adult. You're expected to go off on your own and figure life out.
Yeah.
And it feels like, especially at that time, it feels like you're supposed to do that. And that's not necessarily the case. Like, you know, I would say your 20s are all about a time of just like learning and developing and
just figuring stuff out.
Yeah,
getting all the failure out of your system.
But it feels like you're supposed to have all the answers.
Right. And also just, you know, when you're in your I remember being 25 and like I had graduated university and like I wasn't qualified to do anything.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, what do you do then? Like,
Right.
So
Heroin.
Yeah. I should have done heroin when I was 25 is what I'm trying to say. And hey, I'm 30, so I've still got time. But yeah.
Where to watch? So right now, this is available for rent through Cineplex, which I think where you watched it through, right?
Yeah, this is not an easy movie to find. It's
No,
pretty
unfortunately
much
not.
only on Cineplex, or you have to stream it illegally.
Yeah. I've used Cineplex before to rent movies. It's surprisingly a pretty decent interface, and it's got quite a bit of options.
Yeah, like last night was my first time using Cineplex as well, and I was like, oh, this is fine.
Yeah.
Like, I could rent movies on here.
Yeah.
But I was also like, wait, you can rent movies on Cineplex?
Yeah, so there's a fun fact for anybody who didn't know that. Yeah, I've used it quite a few times, actually. It's just often the place that has the more, like, niche movies that I want to watch sometimes.
So if you're looking for something and you can't find it anywhere, try Cineplex.
Yeah, exactly.
Huh.
Now, I have a funny story here, and I think you share the same thing as me. So I, midweek, earlier this week, went to watch this movie. I looked everywhere for it, and usually my fallback to rent on is YouTube. And so I went to YouTube and rented a movie, and I started it about 2 minutes. It took me about 2 minutes, the opening credits essentially, because I've seen this movie so many times, to realize I just rented T2 Trainspotting. And so this is a PSA to anybody out there. T2 Trainspotting is the sequel to Trainspotting. Don't rent it off of YouTube because that's what you're going to get. The problem is the Trainspotting is really large and the T2 kind of falls in the background. So you see the Trainspotting and you might miss that.
Fun fact, I did the exact same thing Friday night.
Nice.
I was not... Okay, so...
And you hadn't seen the movie before.
Well, okay, here, I went in... Okay, I know... Here's what I went into knowing about Trainspotting. I knew Ewan McGregor was in it. I knew it was Scottish, and I knew it was about heroin.
Yep.
I had no idea there was a sequel 20 years later. So I start watching the sequel, and I'm like, wow, Ewan McGregor kind of has just always looked 40, huh? And then there's a scene about like 40 minutes into the movie where there's a sign outside a bar that says download our app. And I was like, that's weird. I didn't know they did that in the 90s. And then at some point I was like, oh no.
I love how you like didn't realize that for that long. Like you've seen most of T2 Trainspotting. I expect you're gonna like return to it and wrap it up.
I actually was enjoying it quite a lot.
Yeah.
But I was also the downside is it spoiled the ending for me of this movie. I still enjoyed this movie a lot, but
yeah.
Anyways, don't
it's our PSA to pay attention because T2 Trainspotting, the title looks very similar to Trainspotting.
Yes.
And that's, I think, it for our primer episode. If you're interested in this movie, I can't recommend it enough. Please go check it out, despite the limited viewing options for it. Do you have any last-minute words you want to say before we cut her off?
Don't watch the sequel.
Don't watch the sequel first.
Right.
The sequel is pretty good, actually, too.
I was surprised by how good it was.
Yeah, very similar. It's a lot of the same people. But let's talk about that more in spoilers.
Okay.
Have a good one, everyone. We'll see you next week for the full spoiler talk.
Don't do drugs.